What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. And we are coming to you on the eve of the Boston Celtics matchup. Obviously, this is a highly anticipated game as it has been circled on the calendar for the Cavs since the beginning of the season as the true benchmark for where this team is going to be going into the playoffs and having to potentially face them in the Eastern Conference Finals. First seed versus second seed. Obviously, the Boston Celtics are coming off a loss to J.B. Bickerstaff and the Detroit Pistons, and the Cavs are coming off their 8th straight win. The Cavs will also have all of their official roster players on deck for this game, including Darius Garland, who missed out on the last two matchups with a left hip contusion. Chris, going into this matchup, just the aura that surrounds this game, going into TD Garden, understanding what it means for this team, understanding that Kenny Atkinson was very upfront about how important this game was for the team, saying that they are going to do everything in their power to win this game. And it felt like a similar, as we talked about earlier in the season, it felt like this Cavs team pressed too hard going into the first matchup against the Boston Celtics. How do you feel like the Cavs avoid doing that while going full kilter and showing them exactly who they are?
Well, it's going to start tomorrow morning. It's an optional shoot-around as opposed to a mandatory one. So, Kenny Atkinson's trying not to go overboard when it comes to his preparation, trying not to go overboard when it comes to just talking about the meaning of this game. Everybody understands it. Like for the Cavs, it's Boston. It's not New York. It's not Orlando. It's not Indiana. It's not Miami. The belief internally is that there's one team that can prevent them from getting to the NBA Finals, and it's Boston. And I think inside that locker room, the guys don't feel like, hey, we've got to beat Boston to show ourselves something. We've got to beat Boston to prove it to ourselves that we can. They've already done it once so far this year, but if they don't even up the series, it's not going to be something that should change the view of the Cavs, should change their own internal belief about their chances if they were to see Boston in the Eastern Conference Finals. It's still only the end of February. It's about continuing to build habits. It's about focus. It's about attention to detail. It's about following the game plan as much as they possibly can. And I think the most important factor of this one, Ethan, is that the guys that are probably most important to the Cavs in a 7-game series against Boston are going to be available. The Dean Wades of the world are needed in this kind of matchup, just stylistically. The things that the Cavs can do offensively and defensively. They need guys like Dean. They need guys like DeAndre Hunter. They need guys like Max Strus. And having all of those guys available all at the same time, it just gives the Cavs more to work with when it comes to personnel in this particular matchup against a wing-heavy Boston team. And that, to me, from the standpoint of the Cavs and what's meaningful and what's informative, how does DeAndre Hunter look with this team in this system against that team? Because he was the guy that was brought in to bring it all together. He was the guy that was brought in to guard Jason Tatum and guard Jaylen Brown and make the Cavs more versatile, make the Cavs more switchable, make them more explosive on the offensive end of the floor so that they can keep up from three-point range and all these different things. So those are the things that I'm going to be looking for. And as I said, Kenny Atkinson, everybody understands the meaning of this game. It's Cleveland and Boston. There's always going to be higher stakes. There's always going to be more hoopla. But I don't think the Cavs are going overboard in terms of, oh my God, we've got to win this game against Boston because if we don't, it's going to be a disaster.
This is the fourth and final matchup between Boston and the Cavs, and that's why it has been circled, because this is the last test of the regular season that the Cavs get against this Celtics team before their potential matchup in the playoffs. But Chris, you make a great point about DeAndre Hunter, and that's one of the talking points coming into the game on Friday. And the biggest question, based on what Kenny Atkinson has made very clear to almost every reporter that has ever talked to him this season, is that based on matchup, he will make adjustments in the starting lineup if he deems fit, right? Although that necessarily hasn't been the case during the season, is this a situation where you see a
No.
Okay, there you go. All right.
No. The Cavs are on a winning streak. They've played great basketball. And in the words of Kenny Atkinson, look, Kenny is very data oriented, Ethan. You understand that. He's analytically driven. In the words of Kenny Atkinson, we have a net rating of like 70 when Max Strus is surrounding the core four. It's not 70, okay? But it might as well be 70 because the Cavs just obliterate teams when they have Max Strus alongside the core four. Their net rating is an astronomically ridiculous 33.7. In 120 minutes together, basically, the Cavs are outscoring opponents by 33.7 points per 100 possessions. And given the way that they've played with Max in the starting lineup, given the comfort that DeAndre Hunter has shown coming off the bench, and given the way that the Cavs have played as a collective since acquiring DeAndre, since the All-Star break, this just isn't the time to do that. So I cannot see Kenny going that direction for tomorrow night's game. Look, if this was like a playoff series, if it was the first game of the Eastern Conference Finals, if there was a feeling of, Max isn't getting the job done or Max can't hang in a series against Boston, okay, then sure. But that to me would be like the definition of over-preparing, over-analyzing, all those different things. And I think this is really, really important, Ethan. Before DeAndre Hunter got to the Cavs, he was coming off the bench. He was a front runner for Sixth Man of the Year. And he was having a career year in that particular role. It's not to say that DeAndre's not going to start games. It's not to say that, when the Cavs get into a playoff environment, a 7-game series, that he's not going to play starters minutes or anything along those lines. But it's clear, given the fact that he had a career year as a sixth man in that kind of role, it's clear that that's comfortable for him. It's clear that he can be effective in that kind of role. And I also think, the way that Max plays stylistically is very, very different than DeAndre. It's different than Isaac. It's different than Dean Wade. And the Cavs benefit greatly. The Cavs starting group benefits greatly from the movement, from the screening, from the cutting, all those different things that Max brings to the table. So it's just, to me, there's just no reason to even consider going a different kind of way right now. Especially when you have DeAndre, who looks comfortable as can be in that six-man role still.
Well, I'm glad we could get that out the way. This team, I feel like when you talk about what Max Strus brings, when you talk about what DeAndre Hunter has done, when you talk about the different comparisons that can be made throughout the league, I think you look to the Orlando Magic series last year and you say, oh, look at how they did the little front court shuffle that they did to switch out Jonathan Isaac and Wendell Carter Jr., depending on what they felt like was the better option for them throughout the series. Like when they were going up against Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley, they wanted more size, more strength. When Jarrett Allen went down and wasn't able to finish that series, they went back to Jonathan Isaac, right? Mm-hmm. So I definitely think it's intriguing to think about how those different kind of categories can be the similar for Max Strus and DeAndre Hunter when you talk about a playoff series, as you mentioned, and how if Max isn't up to the billing of guarding Jason Tatum or Jaylen Brown in that series, which we know he relishes those opportunities to guard some of the best players in the NBA and show that he's not just a shooter, not just a
Yeah.
scorer, all these things. But the
Whether he
other
has
comparison,
success or not in that matchup, he still relishes it, and he's still going to compete, and he's going to battle. He's not always going to be successful, though, and he
I
hasn't
think
been. And he hasn't been successful throughout the course of this season, last season, even when he was in Miami. Some of those battles. Um, but you're right. Like, he'll compete. He'll have the right intentions. He'll try and be in the right spot. It's just, there are other guys better equipped, um, especially on this roster, at, to be in that kind of role when we start talking about a potential 7-game series.
right. And I think with Max, I think it drives him more when he's unsuccessful because he hates failure that much. Like, he hates losing in any capacity that much. So, like, it drives him to a different level, a different intensity. Sometimes that's beneficial for him. Sometimes it's not, because then he gets handsy, then he gets physical, then he gets in foul trouble. And that's a different dynamic that the Cavs have to direct themselves through. But I think the other thing when it comes to DeAndre Hunter, and like someone that they sent to Atlanta to get DeAndre Hunter, Karis LeVert, I think DeAndre is better suited to stay in one role rather than being kind of yo-yoed between a starter position and a bench role. And obviously we understand that for the last 5 years of his career before this season, he was a starter. And then this year, he was a bench player, and we've seen that he's had the best year of his career, sixth man of the year, as we continuously mentioned. We'll get into some of those odds a little bit later. But I definitely think that that's a comparison that I think is important when you look at how Kenny Atkinson is moderating his lineups and is moderating his starting unit, and knowing that Karis LeVert wasn't a guy that he could just pull back and forth, even though he had to at times. And he doesn't want to put DeAndre Hunter through that as well. The other portion of that is the unit of Ty Jerome and DeAndre Hunter has been successful. And as they showed their chemistry and fun after beating the Orlando Magic and going to Disney World or Disney or Universal, it looked like, going on roller coasters based on Ty Jerome's Instagram story. Like, I just think the chemistry and the built-in like just joy that they have playing the game together is something you can't take away and you can't quantify for opposing defenses. And two, I definitely feel like the second unit is more of a go get your own kind of thing. Like, there's still movement, there's still off the ball sets, off ball movement, and all these other things. But Ty Jerome, DeAndre Hunter, they're guys that Kenny Atkinson doesn't really have to call a whole lot of plays for, right? And
Yeah.
they also get to run with Donovan Mitchell, who calls the plays himself. And that's what Kenny Atkinson kind of preached after the Orlando Magic game, and how Darius Garland doesn't like calling plays all that much. Kenny will call them for him, but when Donovan's the point guard or at the point of attack, he'll get to orchestrate the offense. And sometimes, as Donovan has shown this season, that means just getting off the ball and allowing for his teammates to go to work. DeAndre Hunter shooting 6'8", shooting over defenders with ease. Ty Jerome getting to the basket, getting to his floater, getting to his left hand. All these things that have been very like just continuously proven throughout the season to help the Cavs. But Chris, when we get
It's
into
not as important, Ethan. Like, if we talk about starter versus reserve, the more important thing is who plays best with who. And, like, do you put DeAndre Hunter a majority of minutes with the Darius Garland grouping, or do you put the majority of minutes for DeAndre with the Donovan Mitchell and Evan Mobley grouping, right? Like, do you make sure that a majority of DeAndre's minutes are with Ty Jerome? Do you make sure a majority of his minutes are with Dean Wade or Isaac Okoro? Those are the things that Kenny is looking for. Like, how does the skill set of DeAndre Hunter blend with these other combinations? And obviously, DeAndre and Ty are really, really good together. They've played nearly 100 minutes already together this year. and the Cavs have a 19.8 net rating. Like DeAndre Hunter with Dean Wade's been really, really good too, especially when you throw Evan Mobley in that mix. So it's just trying to figure out those things within the rotation. And that's what Kenny is still digging into. That's what he's still collecting data for, so that he has as much information as he wants and as he can get during the final stretch of the season, so that he can make as informed of a decision as possible. And you don't overreact to small sample sizes. You don't make sweeping conclusions based on small sample sizes. But the one thing that you've seen about DeAndre is that it really hasn't mattered all that much in terms of his success and the team's success, about like who he plays alongside. Now, when you get into the playoffs, it's a little bit different. The competition's very, very different. The pressure is different. The stakes are different. The way that teams scout, game plan, all that kind of stuff is different as well. But you're trying to gain as much information by mixing and matching the looks that you have with DeAndre. So sometimes it's going to be Ty. Sometimes it's going to be Darius. Sometimes it's going to be alongside Donovan, because you're just trying to find those answers. And the only way that you're going to find those answers is you continue to do that, and you continue to look at what it looks like in a real game situation against real competition. So to me, that is more important than whether DeAndre is going to start, whether DeAndre is going to come off the bench. The one thing that we know is more than likely he's going to finish games, because he is one of the most important players that the Cavs have. He has already become one of the most important players that they have, because of his size, because of his athleticism, because of his three-point shooting, because of his versatility, because of his switchability. Like all the things that Kenny wants to do at both ends of the floor, DeAndre is an ideal fit for those things.
Right, and I kind of touched on this before we got into like the minutes of lineups together, because there's only been 6 games with DeAndre Hunter, and we've still seen such a big jump with this team already.
Mhm.
And I mentioned this before about how it was likely that Kenny Atkinson was going to pair DeAndre Hunter with Evan Mobley, because of the fact that he likes pairing Dean Wade with Jared Allen and Darius Garland, right? The top 2 minutes of 3-man lineups for DeAndre Hunter includes Donovan Mitchell, DeAndre Hunter, Evan Mobley for 68 minutes. That has a net rating of plus 8.1 for per 100 possessions. Then it's DeAndre Hunter, Sam Merrill, and Evan Mobley for 53 minutes. That's for a net rating of 16.3 per 100 possessions. And the third is DeAndre Hunter, Ty Jerome, Sam Merrill, which has a net rating of 36.3 per 100 possessions in 53 minutes over a 5-game span, because obviously we know Ty Jerome missed one of those games. And then the fourth one, DeAndre Hunter, Ty Jerome, Evan Mobley for 46 minutes. And that has a net rating of 28 per 100 possessions. So I definitely think it's notable to keep those in mind. And the second most minutes of anybody that DeAndre Hunter has played with in 2-man lineups is Evan Mobley for 91 minutes. The most is 95 minutes alongside Donovan Mitchell. He has a net rating of plus 13 per 100 possessions when on the floor with Evan Mobley, 8.7 when on the floor with Donovan Mitchell. So I definitely think when you look at all of the connective tissue, obviously you try to figure out how, and Chris, you made this point coming into DeAndre Hunter trade, like how Kenny Atkinson is going to be able to use Dean Wade and DeAndre Hunter together. And I think this Boston Celtics game is going to be a big opportunity for them to utilize that lineup and see how that works to put potentially both of them on a perimeter player, and then allow Evan Mobley or Jared Allen, depending on the situation, likely Evan Mobley with Kristaps Porzingis on the perimeter, to continuously hound on the perimeter, but also protecting the paint as well. I just think it's a lineup that Kenny Atkinson is going to be able to have some fun with, and then mix and match players around to see which go well together. Again, this is why this game is so is a measuring stick for this team because of all the implications, not only around the game, but internally about how the Cavs can learn about themselves. And that's the biggest thing for them, as it has been all year, is learning about themselves.
I mean, I think the other thing is, Evan Mobley stylistically has not been able to deal with Kristaps Porzingis. If you look at the games when Porzingis hasn't been out there, that's when Evan has been able to make his mark in this particular matchup. How does he look with Kristaps Porzingis out there? Can he have the success at both ends of the floor? Can he be as impactful as the Cavs have grown accustomed to? Can he be as involved on the offensive end of the floor? Or do you maybe lean on Jared Allen a little bit more? These are all things that Kenny has to look at, because the most recent meeting against Boston, Evan was awful. He had 7 points. He was 3 of 14 from the field, 0 of 4 from three-point range. The previous game against Boston, 9 points, 4 of 13 from the field, 0 of 2 from three-point range. So, Kristaps is a problem. He has been a problem for Evan. It's a tough matchup for him. It's a tough guy for Evan to deal with. And you could sit there and you could say, well, Porzingis causes a lot of problems for a lot of people. Sure, you're right. He's that kind of player. He's an all-star caliber player. He makes them, a completely different team at both ends of the floor. As many Cavs players referred to him last year during the Eastern Conference semifinal series, Porzingis is the cheat code. He's the one that makes Boston different. He's the one that has taken Boston to a completely different level. And Evan Mobley's best game against the Celtics this year, Porzingis didn't play. He feasted. He had 22 points, 11 rebounds, 8 of 13 from the field. So Evan has to show that Porzingis isn't going to be that much of a problem for him. That the evolution that we've seen from Evan Mobley at both ends of the floor, but specifically on the offensive end, that he's not going to be neutralized. He's not going to be minimized. He's not going to be taken out of the game by Porzingis the way that Evan has in the previous two matchups. So that's also something that I'm going to be paying attention to. I think it's something that Kenny Atkinson's going to be paying attention to. That's the beauty of the way that this roster has been constructed, though, Ethan. If Evan is going to struggle with Porzingis like he has in the past, then you have an all-star caliber center that you can give a few more minutes to. You can go away from Evan and you can rely on Jarrett. You can play those guys together and see what that looks like, and see if that creates more opportunities and more openings for Evan. You have a more well-rounded offensive threat in DeAndre Hunter that you can put next to Evan to see if that can create some confusion, some matchup advantages, force some switches against the Celtics. All these different looks are going to be really, really important because, whatever the Cavs can do to try and make things a little bit easier for Evan in this particular matchup against this particular player is going to be beneficial for them in terms of collecting that data and trying to use it the best that they can if these two teams do indeed meet in the conference finals.
And Chris, I want to just put stats behind your words because you're right. I mean, these matchups, when you look at the matchup data against Kristaps Porzingis, I mean, when you look at what Kristaps has held Evan Mobley to in 2 games played against in 7 and around 8 minutes of matchup data based on NBA.com, which we know can be finicky, but I'm going to go through it anyway. He has Evan Mobley's 3 of 12, which is 25% from the field. He has 4 turnovers, He's gotten blocked once, and like he only has 7 points when Kristaps Porzingis is the nearest defender of him during those matchups. And I think when you also turn to the offensive end, you also or when you turn to the defensive end, Evan Mobley kind of does the same thing to Kristaps, which I think is something to monitor as well. In 2 games in around 6 minutes of matchup data, Kristaps just has 6 points on 1 of 6 shooting from the field, 16.7%. He's 0 of 4 from deep in those games. And I think that's another thing. But the biggest thing for me is what you mentioned is how Kristaps Porzingis has a different outlook on the game when guarded by Jared Allen a little bit, who's guarded him for around 12 and a half minutes of matchup data in 12 games. Kristaps has 11 points on 5 of 9 shooting and is 1 of 2 from deep in those matchups. While the Celtics have 55 team points in those 12 minutes rather than having just 16 team points in the 6.5 minutes that Evan Mobley was guarding Kristaps. So I think it's a lot of different data that you have to look into. And I definitely understand your point of view of Evan offensively being stymied by Kristaps Porzingis. But I think if the Cavs considering it a draw, it just depends on what they're getting around the margins as well, and how they may need to lean on other players, or if they're not getting enough, how they can open up the offensive game for Evan Mobley to create for himself, even if Kristaps is on the floor. And I think that's big on big action, like you mentioned, having either Dean Wade or DeAndre Hunter or Jared Allen on the floor with him to set up matchups and switches that would prevent Kristaps from having the advantage on the defensive end. I think those are all different things that we would have to look at coming into tomorrow's matchup against Kristaps and the Boston Celtics.
I mean, look, when you play against Boston, your margin for error shrinks significantly. You have to play really, really good basketball at both ends of the floor just to be competitive with the full strength Celtics, let alone beat them. Let alone beat them 4 times in 7 tries, which is what is required in a playoff series. So it's like the version of Evan Mobley that the Cavs have gotten in the last 2 games against Boston is just not good enough. They're not winning a series if Evan's going to play like that. On the offensive end, he's got to be efficient. On the offensive end, he's got to attack mismatches. On the offensive end, he's got to be more productive. This is a guy who has become a focal point of the team offensively. This is a guy whose evolution on the offensive end has allowed the Cavs to become this team. It's one of the biggest changes from last year's team. Like Ty Jerome was asked recently about, okay, what's the biggest difference between the Cavs of last year and the Cavs of this year? And like, he pointed to the most obvious one. Duh, they made a coaching change. So he brought that up. But like, the version of Evan Mobley that the Cavs have gotten this year is an all-star. He's one of the best players in the entire NBA. He might be Defensive Player of the Year. He might be Most Improved Player. He is an all-star. That's not the version of Evan Mobley that they got last year. There was a different Evan Mobley last year throughout the course of the regular season and for a majority of the playoffs, right? The version of Darius Garland that the Cavs have gotten this year is back to his all-star level. Very, very different than last year's team. You know, some of the other pieces have gotten better as well. And Ty Jerome is healthy, unlike last year where he played in just 2 games. So there are other differences when you talk about this year's team versus last year's team. But Evan Mobley and just unlocking him and turning him into this, that is a huge difference for the Cavs. That is a big part of them becoming a legitimate championship contender. But like, he has to play like that guy against the Celtics, especially against the Celtics. You know, it's one thing to do it against Orlando. The Cavs don't need Evan Mobley to be great against Orlando in a potential 1-8 matchup if that were to happen, right? But if you're going to beat Boston, if you're going to do it 4 times in 7 tries, you have to have your best, most important players making the biggest impact. And in the last 2 games, if we're being honest, you know, Evan hasn't been up to his standard. He hasn't been up to the standard that has helped the Cavs get to the point where they are currently. So he's got to be good tomorrow against the Celtics. If the Celtics are going to be full strength, that's an if, because Jaylen Brown didn't play in their previous game. But if the Celtics are going to be at full strength on the road in TD Garden, Evan Mobley's going to have to be better than he's been the last couple of games.
And just to piggyback on that, Chris, I mean, Jaylen Brown, Drew Holiday, and Luke Kornet are all questionable for Boston for tomorrow's matchup. Obviously, the two major ones are Jaylen Brown and Drew Holiday. Luke Kornet is a bench guy that has given the Cavs some fits in the past, but we know that if Drew Holiday isn't out there hounding Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell, or Jaylen Brown isn't doing the same thing, they're a completely different team, and I think the Cavs hope that they are at their full health as well, so they get a better gauge of the Celtics rather than playing against a hampered Celtics team, even though the biggest matchup is the one that we have been covering, which is Kristaps and Evan Mobley. But you mentioned the jump this season that has been Evan Mobley, and I think we have to go into something that came out earlier today, which is a new ringer a new ringer list of talent of players throughout the league and where they ranked in the NBA. And I think the Cavs got a lot of love in this list, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it. So Donovan Mitchell, Evan Mobley, Darius Garland, and Jarrett Allen were all in the top 50 at the beginning of the season. Donovan Mitchell was ranked 12th. Evan Mobley was ranked 22nd. Darius Garland was ranked 33rd. Jarrett Allen was rated 49th. But now, Donovan Mitchell is 8th on that list. Evan Mobley is 16th on that list. Darius Garland is 25th on that list. And Jarrett Allen is 46th. Not to mention, DeAndre Hunter was 91st on the list, and he's now down to 84. So, Chris, we also mentioned a lot about the end of season awards, and Evan Mobley's stock has been rising in those as well. We're getting to those a little bit later. But where do you think about these updated rankings when it comes to the Ringers top 100 players? Donovan Mitchell being a top 10 player in the MVP race. I think he's 8th in the MVP race anyway, so I think that makes a lot of sense. Evan Mobley 16th, Darius Garland top 25. There were some guards on this list, point guards around the league that were questionable about being ahead of Darius Garland. I just wanted to know if you got a chance to take a look at this and what your thoughts were.
No, I mean, I think the Cavs, from my initial view, all their guys are about where you would expect them to be and probably where they deserve to be. Darius has had a great year. He deserves a ton of credit for playing like an all-star. He's been one of the best guards in the Eastern Conference. But my God, there are so many good guards in the NBA. There's so many good players in the NBA. So if you start reshuffling rankings and say, well, X player should be higher, it's the same conversation that you have when it comes to all-star voting. It's like, cool, you think a guy was snubbed. All right, if you're going to put him on the team, then you have to take somebody off the team. And when it comes to Darius, when it comes to Evan, if you want to put either one of those guys higher, then you have to put somebody lower. If you want to put Donovan Mitchell a little bit higher, got to put somebody else a little bit lower. And it's just, when I looked at those rankings from the Ringer, when you take into account this year, when you take into account the view of those guys coming into this season based on what they've accomplished throughout the course of their career, like a bunch of different factors, when you take into account role and responsibility on their team, offense, defense, all those different things. Upon my first look, I didn't think there was anybody that stood out as a guy who definitely had no case being in front of either Donovan or Evan or Darius. I think Darius is about a top 25 player in the game, and he's ranked as a top 25 player. I think Donovan Mitchell's a top 10 player in the game. I think Evan Mobley, this version of Evan Mobley, if we continue down this path, is going to be a top 5 player in the game. But is he there yet? No, Not quite yet, but top 20? Yeah, I think that's a legitimate conversation. I think that's something to be proud of. I think that's about accurate. Um, so it just shows like how far these individual players have come and how far the Cavs have come in such a short stretch of time. And they deserve every bit of recognition that they're getting and every bit of love that they're getting. But the Cavs aren't the only team in the NBA that have great players, right? Darius isn't the only great guard or point guard in the NBA. So I think 3 of the top 25 players in the NBA is just about right. And then Jared is just hard, right? Because so many of the things that he does well, they contribute to winning at a high level. But like there's also a ceiling in terms of his individual talent, right? Like, and it doesn't take away from what he means to the Cavs at both ends of the floor. It doesn't take away his nightly impact, but his production just isn't always going to match some of these other guys. His all-around skill set, including like his offensive package, is just not going to match with a lot of these other guys around the NBA. So it's just Jarrett has always been a really, really difficult conversation because he's always going to be defined by impact as opposed to production.
I agree. And
I mean, was
I
there
think that's
somebody that you saw ahead of Darius in the top 25 that you're like, no, guy shouldn't be there?
no, no, I don't think there was somebody that's like alarmingly like out of place. I just think like there's definitely a player on here that I'm not a big fan of, even though he has the reputation of being a like top 25 player in the NBA, and like he just went off for a big scoring night the other day. So it would be poor timing on my part to kind of throw out some blame on that character. But
You're
I
really going to say
definitely think,
Tyrese Haliburton?
yeah, that's
Like,
what I'm talking about. But
no. I mean,
no,
like,
I'm not saying he's out of place. I'm just saying that that's the player that stuck out to me. That was like, I would take Darius Garland over Tyrese Haliburton. If it was 1-on-1, I'm taking those Darius Garland over Tyrese.
I don't know, like, it's a legitimate conversation, and I'm looking like Darren Fox is right in that mix. I mean, they're right clustered together. They're separated by what, 5 or 6 spots or something like that. You know,
Yeah,
the
Tyrese is 19
conversation,
on this list.
yeah, 5 or 6 spots, like I said. The conversation with Darius becomes difficult because, and this is what we talked about a little bit when we were going through all the All-Star stuff. Darius Darius isn't the engine of the Cavs offense, right? Like, he is not the focal point of the Cavs offense. He does not draw the same kind of attention as some of these other number one options do. And that's the conversation that becomes difficult. Because to me, it's not comparing apples to apples. Tyrese Haliburton has it harder than Darius Garland because he doesn't play alongside Donovan Mitchell. He doesn't play alongside Evan Mobley. So we do these things with these comparisons, but like Darius is the number 2. He is the Robin to Donovan Mitchell's Batman. He might actually be the Alfred to Donovan Mitchell's Batman and Evan Mobley's Robin. You know what I mean? Um, so I just think it becomes a difficult conversation with Darius because he just doesn't have to deal with the same pressure, the same expectations, the same level of responsibility, the same level of defensive attention, like all that stuff that Tyrese Haliburton gets. And for Tyrese to be the clear-cut engine of the Pacers offense where like they can't function without him. They play at the pace that they do because he drives it. They play so much pick and roll stuff because he drives it. And that was one of the best offenses that we've ever seen. last year for the Pacers. So for him to be the clear-cut alpha driving that, it's a different kind of conversation. I don't want to say that it gets him bonus points, but like it gets him a little bit more leeway. And I know you kind of shrugged when I said Darius is not the engine of the offense. As long as Donovan Mitchell's here, he's not going to have the same importance. He's not going to
No,
have the same role, the same responsibility.
yes,
There's a
I agree with you.
hierarchy. There's a
I agree with you.
hierarchy.
I agree with you. I'm saying I think the phrasing you saying the focal point after that is what I can agree with. The engine, the offense, I think when you talk about like being the table setter for Donovan Mitchell, like you start the offense, you're bringing the ball to the floor, you're kicking it up to Donovan or whatever. I think Darius Garland needs to get a little bit more credit for that. But I will also say that Donovan Mitchell will be the focal point of this team. He is the franchise face. We understand that. We know that. And when it comes to my take on Tyrese Haliburton, it's less to do with how he plays the game. Well, no, it's less to do with the statistics around his game rather than how he looks playing the game, how he goes about his game, right? And we know he's an Olympian. He's a gold medalist, even though he didn't play. He's an Olympian. He's a gold medalist. He has all of these accolades. He's one of the better players. He just signed a max contract. All these things, but his jump shot's ugly. Like,
Goes in at a high rate. Doesn't matter if it's ugly. There are no pictures on a scorecard.
There's no pictures on a scorecard. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I'm not telling him to change his jump shot, but I'm saying, like, when you talk about players that I enjoy watching play the game, Tyrese Haliburton doesn't come to mind for me. Like, the offense is flowing, and he gets the ball up the court, and he's a great passer, but I do not envy anybody that has to stay up watching or editing highlights of Tyrese Haliburton. That's not my stitch, right? Again, to be very clear, this is nothing to do with being the focal point of the offense or any of that. I understand those points, and I understand that Tyrese Haliburton has to go through more at the point of attack offensively and has more defensive scheming against him because his Robin is Pascal Siakam and his Alfred is Miles Turner rather than Donovan Mitchell being Batman and Evan Mobley. I still can't believe you said Darius Garland was Alfred. That was insane. But no, I just
Darius
think
could be a number one option on a legitimate contending team.
Is that a question, or are you saying that?
That's a question. Do you think he can?
Yeah, I think he could. I definitely think he could. Because
what's the ceiling for that team?
What's the ceiling for that team?
Yeah.
It depends on who's around him. Who's his Robin? Who's his Alfred? I think it's key for that. But I want to say, like, because of the improvements that Darius Garland has made to his body, and obviously that's hard to say as he's coming off a hip contusion, but we understand that he's stronger, he's smarter, his game is significantly better. This version of Darius Garland could be the number one option of an offense and of a team that is a playoff contender. I would say the ceiling is an Eastern Conference semifinals if it's just him, right? But I'm wary to say that it could go further than that, depending on who's around him. Like, I don't know if you say. I'm trying to think of Eastern Conference teams that are kind of on the bubble right now. If you put him on the Chicago Bulls, is he gonna bring that team to the playoffs? No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if you put him on the Miami Heat, I think that's interesting, right? Like you put him alongside Bam, you put him alongside Duncan Robinson and Tyler Hero. I do think he's then the number one option on that team. Because I don't think Bam's the number one option, and I think Tyler Hero is better suited in a role. He was better playing alongside Jimmy Butler than by himself. I think that team is an Eastern Conference semifinals team. You put him on the Orlando Magic. I mean, that team's already on
Mm-hmm.
the cusp of that, but I don't think he's a number one option on that team because of Paolo Banchero, right?
Mm.
Um,
There are so many things about Darius's game that you love, and he's been such a big part of the Cavs becoming the best team in the Eastern Conference to this point. They do not get to this point without the dynamic of him and Donovan together in the backcourt. It is arguably the best backcourt in the entire NBA, and it creates this dynamic combination that has helped the Cavs become one of the best offenses that we've ever seen in the NBA. So this isn't a knock against Darius in any sort of way. And I think he's going to continue to get better and better. And the improvements that he's made on the defensive end of the floor, where he's getting steals, he's getting deflections, he's getting into the passing lanes, he's battling guys as best he can after switches, he's fighting through screens a little bit better. This isn't a knock against Darius. But I've seen Tyrese Haliburton take his team to the Eastern Conference Finals. I have. And whoever put this list together from The Ringer also saw Tyrese Haliburton take his team to the Eastern Conference Finals. And that's not the best roster in the NBA, okay? The run that he had in the playoffs, like, you can't ignore that. And I think there's a legitimate question. There has to be a legitimate question about whether Darius would be capable of that kind of thing. And we're probably not going to get an answer to that for a long, long time, because the beauty of this roster is he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to be that guy, because that guy is Donovan Mitchell, and because Evan Mobley is a unicorn and he's played to the level that he's played to this year. So, like, the responsibility and the things that the Cavs need from Darius, it's not to the same level as what Indiana needs from Tyrese Haliburton. But it's hard to overlook a guy like that when you've seen him as the number one, as the alpha, take his team to the conference finals. Whether you want to sit here and say that it was a fluke or not, whether you want to sit here and say that Indiana was fortunate because they won the battle of attrition more so against New York than anything else, like, sure, maybe. But, like, you can't just ignore the fact that he took his team to the conference finals as the lead dog. Again, it's not a knock against Darius, and it doesn't mean that I think Tyrese Haliburton is the best player in the NBA or anything like that. Like, we're just having one conversation comparing two guys. It's a harder comparison to make because of their roles and their responsibilities. But I can't sit here and tell you for sure that I think Darius, as the lead dog, could take his team to the conference finals. Because
so
I just haven't seen evidence of that. And I don't know if I'm going to see evidence of that ever.
putting Darius Garland, I think this would have been the best way to do this. Putting Darius Garland, switching him with Tyrese Haliburton, this version of Darius Garland last year, you don't think Darius Garland is leading that team to the Eastern Conference Finals?
No, I don't. Like, I just can't sit here and assume that the answer is yes, just because I
Okay.
like Darius and because I think he's a really, really good player. I don't think Darius can be a number one in the NBA. I do not. I think he is better suited and that's okay. That's fine. Not everybody is made to be the number one. Like, it's hard to sit here and say, well, we saw the Cavs ceiling with Darius Garland as the guy, as the franchise face, because one, that was so early into Darius's career, that was still early into the rebuild. So it's not really fair to say that. But, like, stylistically with Darius, I think he needs another dynamic creator next to him, like Donovan Mitchell. And the beauty of this roster makeup is that Donovan fills in the Darius gaps. Like, the areas where you may have some concern about Darius the player or Darius's playing style, you don't have as much concern based on this roster composition. The other thing that helps him is that he's got two elite rim protectors behind him on the defensive end of the floor. So it's a little bit easier to cover up for some of those weaknesses. It's a little bit easier to quote unquote hide him on the defensive end of the floor. So I think Darius, I think it's fine to be an elite second fiddle. I think that's a role where he can flourish for the remainder of his career, but consistently over the course of an 82 game season, consistently throughout the course of a playoff run, I just don't think Darius can be that guy. At least I have my doubts about whether he can be that guy. I don't have any reason to doubt that with Tyrese Haliburton because I've seen it.
I think it's funny that we talk a lot about injuries when it comes to Darius Garland, and Tyrese Haliburton has had one season so far in his career where he's played more games than Darius Garland.
Yeah.
So that's interesting to me, just going through the career statistics right now and looking side by side and trying to pull out different arguments as we go through this. Also hilarious that I was trying to be very subtle on the person I was not going to bring up by name. And Chris said, let's go into it. You know, that's how we do it on this podcast. You gotta reel out the conversations and the debates.
I've been working with you long enough to know exactly who you were talking about.
Hey man, I think I gave a couple of good hints. I was trying to let the listeners and the viewers know without being without being too mean about it. But I mean, I'm looking at these seasons as Darius Garland was like the main guy. So before Donovan got here in 2022, 2023, so 2021, 2022 is basically the year that Darius was coming into his own. He was an all-star. He was by himself. And that was the same year that Tyrese Haliburton got traded to the Indiana Pacers. He played, well, I guess he played more games that season than Darius combined as well. But he played 51 games in Sacramento, 26 in Indiana. He played 36.1 minutes per game. In Indiana, he averaged 17.5 points per game, 41.6 from deep, 50.2 from the field. That same season, Darius averaged 35.7 minutes per game. He shot 46.2% from the field, 38.3 from deep, and was 21.7 points per game. Obviously, we know the Cavs got to the play-in tournament that year, and they were knocked out. But I don't know what the Pacers team did that season in the playoffs when it comes to 2021, 2022.
Would you take Kyrie Irving on your team?
What do you? Okay, hold on. What are we talking about?
No. I'm just asking a question. Would you take Kyrie Irving on your team?
On what team? Like, are we talking about this team?
On any team. The answer is yes. You would always take Kyrie Irving.
Yes.
But the bottom line is he's not a number one. He can never be a number one. He never was a number one. He tried to be a number one, and it did not work out because he just doesn't have the game. He doesn't have the skill set. He doesn't have the size. He doesn't have the defensive chops. He doesn't have some of the things that you need to have to be a number one. He has the number one mentality. He's an alpha. But at the end of the day, this is the NBA. This is trying to win a championship. Guys that look and play like Kyrie Irving, you don't win championships with those guys as your number one guy. You just don't. Okay? But that's not to say that there's anything wrong with Kyrie. He might be the best number two of the last 10 to 15 years. Right? It doesn't take anything away from him that he can't be the man to win a championship. It doesn't take anything away from Darius that I have my doubts about him being the man to potentially win his team a championship. It's okay to be a number two. It's okay to be Robin. Like Kyrie Irving's one of the greatest scorers of the last 10 to 15 years. His handle's incredible. But like when you're asked to be the number one, the responsibility that comes with that, the pressure that comes with that, it's a little bit too much for somebody like Kyrie. The consistency that you have to play with, it's too much for Kyrie, and that's okay. But I feel the
Also,
same
just
way about Darius.
that's understandable. And just to finish the point that I was making about the 2021-2022 Indiana Pacers, they finished 13th in the Eastern Conference, 25-57. Obviously, that's not all due to to Tyrese Haliburton, who was only there for 26 games that season. So not a good kind of measuring stick. But I definitely think that's the only fair argument when it came to the Ringers top 25 and who I would try and move between Darius and the top 25. That's the only one that I had questions about, but that's because of my personal preference,
Yeah.
not because of statistics and all those different things. But
I'm more
just
of
to
a
finish,
Darius guy than De'Aaron Fox. I'm not a huge De'Aaron Fox guy. So I'd probably
see,
consider the possibility of having Darius ahead of De'Aaron Fox. It's a legitimate debate that I'd have to research a little bit more. But upon
right.
first look, I'd probably favor Darius just a little bit more in that conversation.
Yeah, because I think, well, okay, we're not gonna go into that and even further, but yeah, I think that would be my second one. But I definitely think that De'Aaron Fox has proven himself in this league as well. But going back to the Kyrie Irving point to wrap up the podcast, I definitely think when we talk about like the one-on-ones and the All-Star game and stuff, I don't care how tall Kyrie Irving is. I don't care who he's going up against. I'm taking Kyrie Irving in the one-on-one if they get that in the All-Star game next year. Like he has the deepest bag in the NBA. He has the best handle in the NBA. I do not care. I like it. It is a work of art watching him dribble. And this is like, and as JJ Redick said, the kids are going to say I'm glazing him. But like, the fact is that Kyrie Irving is playing defense with the basketball in his hand. Like, he can make maneuvers away from defenders because of the reaction to what they're doing. Like, that is the most beautiful thing about basketball, and that's one of the favorite things that I have when it comes to comparing Darius Garland, because of his handle and how it feels like he's always making music when that kind of when it comes to his dribbles. I'm not comparing Darius Garland and Kyrie Irving's bags, but I'm saying like the shiftiness of Darius Garland is definitely up there in the league. I think it's top 5 when it comes to ball handling. But
Like, I
Chris, we're
mean,
gonna get
Kyrie used to give it to LeBron in one-on-one games at the end of practices during those finals runs. And those were competitive battles between the two guys. But yes, in a one-on-one environment, Kyrie Irving can hang with anybody in the NBA. And some of those battles between him and LeBron were so fun to watch. They were so intense, so much trash talk. But this isn't golf. This isn't tennis. This isn't one-on-one. This isn't the streets. This isn't playground basketball. This is still 5-on-5.
agreed. And they'll play 5-on-5 basketball tomorrow against the Boston Celtics in TD Garden. And we'll have to see that one of the other players that people say is really good at one-on-one, Jason Tatum. See how he'll come back about going up against the Cleveland Cavaliers in his first matchup against DeAndre Hunter in a Cleveland Cavaliers uniform. But with that being said, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs insider and interact with Chris, me, and Jimmy by subscribing to Subtext. This is where you can send in your questions for our weekly Hey Chris episode, or if you want to debate about the Tyrese Haliburton, De'Aaron Fox, Darius Garland, all that stuff, you can send in all of those comments to us directly to our phones, and we can send our responses back to you. Go a little back and forth if you have debates with us about the topic. But to do all that, sign up for a 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. all you have to do is text the word STOP. It's easy, but we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around, because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me, Chris, and Jimmy. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.